Hi, friends. Father Kerry Walters here, pastor of Holy Spirit American National Catholic Church, and this is another Holy Spirit moment, this time on being nothing, nowhere. We're continuing our discussion of the Cloud of Unknowing, that wonderful 14th century text on mysticism and contemplation, whose author is anonymous. The last time we looked at the Cloud of Unknowing, we saw that the author suggests that the would-be contemplative needs to find himself or herself suspended between two clouds. One is the cloud of forgetting, and the other is the cloud of unknowing. We need to sink into the cloud of forgetting all of the sensory information that comes to us, all of the stuff that we derive from our five senses, all of our impressions about the physical material world. And what we need to do is to sink into the cloud of unknowing all of the stuff that our interior senses tell us, our imagination and our reason, as well as the faculty of will. We need to somehow forego interior knowledge and exterior knowledge. We need to empty ourselves of it in order to make ourselves utterly receptive to God. Now, after one has progressed in contemplation, what the author of the Cloud of Unknowing seems to suggest is that the two clouds become one, that they become a great emptiness, as he puts it, into which the contemplative enters. The contemplative enters this cloud, this darkness, this void, this emptiness, at first with a great deal of fear and trembling. Because think about this. He or she has stripped him or herself of all sensory information, and he or she has done as best as he or she can to strip away all intellectual faculties, all ideas, all preconceptions, all theories about not only God, but the nature of reality in general. And as a consequence, being in that dark, empty space can be a forlorn and frightening experience. But what the Cloud of Unknowing's author assures us is that the fright which we encounter when we go into that cloud of emptiness is actually a purgation. And it is intended ultimately to strip away the last shreds of selfhood that we carry with us. We can strip away all of our sensory knowledge. We can strip away all of our rational theories. We can even do something to tamp down our will. But the self, the ego, the assumption that we are the center of the universe remains until it's purged away in that dark cloud. You can see, if you've read St. John of the Cross, who comes a couple of centuries after the Cloud of Unknowing, that he must have been influenced by the Cloud of Unknowing's analysis of what happens in the dark void, because St. John of the Cross will famously talk about the dark night of the senses on the one hand and the dark night of the soul on the other, which seems to correspond pretty well to what the author of the Cloud of Unknowing is saying here. When we enter into that void, however, and stay in it long enough to have our self stripped away, we discover, says the author, that it is fullness, fullness beyond measure. It reminds me of what the 17th century metaphysical poet Henry Vaughan said about an experience of God. He called it a dazzling brilliance. Something about that darkness that can't be spoken, that can't be enunciated, that lies beyond the categories of thought, brings us into union with God. We strip away everything that might have impeded that union, and boom, there it is. What the author of the Cloud of Unknowing is appealing to here is what's known as apophatic mysticism, or negative mysticism. Apophasis is a Greek word simply for denial. When we engage in this kind of route to God, what we do is to slowly strip away from our consciousness anything and everything that isn't God. We deny that this is God and that is God and this is God until what we're left with is God. But the thing about it is that God is not a thing. So when you begin to strip away everything that God isn't, what you oughtn't to do is to expect something palpable, an object left in your hand at the end of the process. No, what you find is the no thing, which is God. And you find it because you have become a nothing, a no thing. And you are nowhere. That is, you're not situated, you're not grounded in any intellectual theory or any intellectual hypothesis about who or what God might be. Towards the end of the Cloud of Unknowing, the author pays homage to the individual who really got the apophatic way of knowing God off the ground, a person who has come to be known as the Pseudo-Dionysius, or sometimes just called Dionysius the Areopagite. We used to think that this famous text of negative theology or negative mysticism, which Dionysius wrote, dated from around the 6th century, and that the author of that particular book simply took the name of a person that St. Paul encountered in Athens. But several scholars now believe that in point of fact, the book could indeed have been written by the same Dionysius in Athens that Paul meets. Don't know which of those particular theories is correct, and I'm not really concerned about that. But the main point is that the Areopagite, the Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, really seems to have influenced the Cloud of Unknowing's author. Especially in this, and this is one of the most wonderful things about the analysis of being nowhere and being nothing that the Cloud author offers us. When we can finally become nothing nowhere, when we can finally strip away everything that prevents us from entering into the dazzling darkness, the fullness beyond measure of God, we experience what the Greeks called theopoesis. We become divinized. That is, we become so closely in union with God that we take on a different kind of nature. Let me read to you what the author of the Cloud of Unknowing has to say about this process. It's in chapter 67 of his book. When we achieve in entering into this dazzling darkness, when our mind is free of involvement with anything material or spiritual, and totally taken up with the being of God himself, this happens. At such times, we transcend ourselves, becoming almost divine, though remaining beneath God. I say we transcend ourselves, becoming almost divine, because we gain by grace what is impossible to us by nature. For this union with God in spirit, in love, and in oneness of desire is the gift of grace. Almost divine. Yes, we and God are so one that we and any real contemplative may in a sense truly be called divine. Theopoesis, being somehow so in union with God that we take on a near godlike character, being so embedded in the very being of God that our mortal being becomes divinized. We don't become God, of course, but we become God-like in our intimacy with God. One final word. You would think, wouldn't you, if you read this in a rather casual way, that becoming nothing nowhere would mean that we completely detach from the world once and for all. But the author of the Cloud of Unknowing is quite clear that these moments of unity are rare, are far and few between, and that we return to the world after them. And the important thing is that they enhance our ability to show love in the world, to feel gratitude for the beauty of creation, and to foster rich and intimate relationships with our sisters and brothers. Contemplation isn't a withdrawal from the world. It's a union with God, and that unity with God throws us into the world in a much richer, more spiritual way than we could otherwise have experienced. If you would care to know a little bit more about the apophatic mystical tradition, I might recommend to you one of my own books, Soul Wilderness. It is what I hope is a user-friendly introduction to negative mysticism or negative theology. I'm Father Kerry Walters, and this has been another Holy Spirit moment. Thank you so much. I will see you again soon.